The Bourgeois Hero, a conversation piece in 2 acts about the music and the life of Richard Strauss. The participants, in order of appearance, are American author Jonathan Cott, German-American critic Henry Levinger, German composer Wolfgang Fortner, German conductor Wolfgang Sawallisch, English author and record producer John Culshaw, English author and conductor Norman Delmar, American composer Stanley Silverman, and Canadian philosopher Geoffrey Payzant. The Bourgeois Hero, Act 1.
Remembrance, like Rembrandt, is dark and festive. That's just a line from Nabokov's autobiography. Remembrance, like Rembrandt, is dark and festive. And I thought of that with regard to Strauss because every time I put on, let's say, the Oboe Concerto, I'm struck that I'm already in the midst of things, in medias res, as if the world just begins somewhere before and is never going to end, really.
I've met him first in 1924 through his son, who studied law also in Heidelberg. When I finished my law studies and made up my mind that I would like to go into music, Strauss invited me to come to Garmisch. Our relationship was rather casual, I would say, as far as teaching goes. Let's talk about music. This was about the content, you know? I didn't learn any counterpoint, harmony, or anything. He said, if you want to know how one does things like that, look at the little masterpiece or the big masterpiece, like the score of Salome. You see, he didn't underrate himself.
A very poor young boy. But I had a friend, and the father of this friend was a great industrial boss. And he has wonderful place in the opera house, and I had this place with my friend. And I look, Strauss came in the orchestra, and the old musicians of Leipzig Gewandhaus, with a very big dignity, yes. Stand up, the maestro had his entrance in the orchestra room. Yes. And I see the wonderful hand go high, a hand of an enormous possibility of expression. And it is beginning, wie schön ist die Prinzessin Salome heute Nacht.
Yes, I remember very well here in Munich, and this is one of my really biggest impressions, Strauss conducting Così fan tutte. With him on cembalo, playing cembalo to give every situation on stage the personal Richard Strauss modulation and sometimes very, very short thema of his own works. Yes, he did it. It was so subtle, so fantastic and so delicate, extremely delicate, but nobody could say, why he conducts Mozart and why he gives his personal Strauss. No, it was a fantastic combination between Mozart and Strauss.
I heard of him another piece. I heard in Bayreuth, 33, Parsifal, conducting by Strauss. And I must say, the best was the second act, this was his world. And the romantic style for the third act, it was a little not so important. But you must understand, I know it was arranged for him a party of scat after the piece, and he hoped to finish the piece 20 minutes earlier.
Well, it was a very, very moving occasion when he came to London. It was 1947 or 48. And it was extraordinary to believe that this was the man, who written Till Eulenspiegel and Don Juan. And there he was. I was going to say fragile, but I think he was really fragile. He moved very slowly, but I mean, he was quite stocky. And he had the most extraordinary stick technique I think I've ever seen. Strauss got, if memory serves me right, the most miraculously intense playing by appearing to do absolutely nothing at all. All those great climaxes came off, and he just scarcely moved his baton. I suppose he did it with his eyes or something.
Yes, I do agree. When I was quite young, I went to a concert once, and I saw him conducting Don Juan and Don Quixote in the Queen's Hall. He came over to a concert like that. And we were all talking about this strange man who could begin Don Juan, just a flip of a finger and seemed to mean nothing to him at all. But he was no longer so attractive a figure, much more wrapped up in his own very narrow it had become life, stuck away really, and conducting, being let out, as it were, if you like to think of it that way, to appear almost as royalty, to conduct the odd performance of the great works, and then going back home to garnish as soon as possible in order to play Scott again. This is not a very attractive vision of it, but it does sound a little bit as a man who feels that the world has left him behind and he doesn't anymore have much interest in what's going on. And so he closed himself between blinkers. He felt that the world had changed and he no longer had that same interest in the world.
Now, I don't mean to put Strauss down because, quite honestly, one of the worst things about the educational system is that if you are growing up at a time when the climate is against somebody really terrific like Strauss, you find it convenient to sort of dislike somebody like that because it's just one less person you have to deal with. But in the great wars that emanated from either side of the boulevards in Los Angeles between Schoenberg and Stravinsky, there was only one person that they both seemed to agree was some kind of enemy, and that was Strauss.
They put him down, they brand him. I think the reason why Strauss is picked on is quite obvious. I think there is a relationship between politics and music. Klemperer had a very funny line about Strauss. He said that he believed, that is Klemperer believed, that Strauss cooperated with the Nazis because, in Klemperer's words, Germany had 50 opera houses and America only had 2. That's quite a remarkable line.
The brainwashing that was being done from the highest levels by the most significant 20th century composers at that particular time really led the North Americans to detach certainly from Strauss. And I think a lot of us are feeling a little silly about it now.
I think he was probably a rather simple man. He was certainly naive politically, as we all know. I think he must have been a very strange character in many ways. I think a lot of the clue to that probably lies in the character of his wife and the relationship between them. I suppose he was very private. I think George Marek chose very aptly when he called his book on Strauss The Life of a Non-Hero. He just went along with the tide and, of course, paid in a way rather dearly for it in the end.
can only answer you with a word of his wife. His wife, Pauline, I must say in German, auf Bayerisch. Ich kann nicht so gut Bayerisch, Dialekt, but she has said, ich weiß ja, dass mein Richardl ein Depp ist, aber in der Musik, da tobt sich halt aus.
I tell you, you couldn't have gotten a better word for it. It was just the privilege to live for a year in the shadow of a master of this importance, enjoy his company, his talks, and his home.
I'm inclined to sympathize and to be rather sorry for Strauss in what happened to him in respect of world history. And the world went all wrong, and Strauss couldn't cope. It's on the cards that he wasn't a very strong personality. But he was born at the best time possible. When he started, the times were exactly right for the particular qualities that he got to flourish and to attract attention.
Obviously great talent, entering into maturity in the last third of the 19th century, would certainly, in Germany at least, be in a philosophical environment. Germans would talk very seriously about philosophers, perhaps as North Americans might about hockey players, and they would be most likely to discuss two philosophers who had quite important effects upon the thought and the work of Richard Strauss, one being Schopenhauer and the other being Nietzsche. Strauss' first acquaintance with Schopenhauer was, interestingly enough, by way of a fiddler. One of the first violinists in the orchestra at Meiningen, I believe, Alexander Ritter, befriended the young Richard Strauss and introduced him to a good many things which he had not seriously considered or thought about previously, including the writings of Richard Wagner and the writings of Schopenhauer himself. Now, Schopenhauer wrote a famous essay on music as part of his big work, The World as Will and Idea. In fact, it's the conclusion of Book 3 of this work. And Schopenhauer in this says that he had thought about all the arts. He had just drawn up a scheme, a kind of hierarchy of all the arts from lower to higher, with predictably architecture at the bottom as the most materiality bound, and sculpture next to that, and then painting, and then the dramatic arts, and working up through them to poetry. And there he had stopped because he didn't know quite where music would fit into this scheme. So he tells us, right in the text of the book, The World as Will and Idea, he tells us that he stopped writing. He got away from the book for a few weeks and just thought about music and listened to it. At any rate, Schopenhauer did this. And then he came back and he said, finally, music doesn't fit this scheme. Music is above it. Music does not belong in a kind of a lower to higher arrangement of the arts. It is in the direction of the top, but it is beyond. And he ended up by saying some such thing as that music embodies the ultimate reality of the universe exactly as the universe itself embodies that same reality. He says that music puts us into contact with reality not as an expression of it or a replication of it, but as that reality itself. I would think it difficult for anybody in those days when Strauss was coming into his rapid maturity as an artist not to be influenced.
Do you mean that his music expresses philosophy? Not at all. I think he was a naive person, completely. In fact, I don't think he thought of this at all. I think he was a non-thinker in this sort of way. I think there is a big disparity in a lot of people between what they are and what they are able to express. The big example of this is Wagner, isn't it, actually, who is such an absolute devil incarnate in his relationships with people, but was able to be so humane and so humorous and so genial in Meistersinger. It all went into his art. And I think all Strauss's emotionalism went into his art, which is why he was capable of doing things which afterwards people thought of as being highly culpable. He didn't think of it as highly culpable because the whole ethic of it was out of the question. As a person, from what I gather, he actually was more proud of his prowess at cards than he was of his ability as a composer. It's a strange facet of his professionalism. Obviously, this is going to take us to Nietzsche, isn't it, if we're not careful?
Nietzsche came into Strauss's active intellectual life as a result of an illness. He had some kind of bronchial disorder, as I recall, and his uncle said, "You must go on a long trip." He went actually to Egypt, and there he read, during his convalescence from this illness, Nietzsche's book, the big poem, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Now, Strauss, when he read Nietzsche, read it in a way that gave him a very unsatisfactory result as far as the same Alexander Ritter is concerned. Ritter was a pious gentleman, and Strauss, having read Nietzsche and having been influenced, said that the trouble with Christianity is that it allows the believer to deny responsibility for his own actions. Once having confessed his sins, he's absolved of them. And Strauss thought, after Nietzsche, that this was morally debilitating. When one of Strauss's libretti was modified to accommodate some such view as this, Ritter protested it vigorously, and their friendship was never as warm afterward. But Strauss himself said all he was trying to say here was that the voice of his God speaks through himself. In other words, he was affirming some kind of heroic, triumphant, egoistic humanism.
Mind you, most people who talk about Nietzsche misunderstand what Nietzsche said in Zarathustra anyway. But one thing does seem to me perfectly clear. If none of us understand Nietzsche, nor did Strauss, I think Strauss has got no more from Zarathustra than the rather splendid idea which Nietzsche himself expressed once, that this could be turned into a symphony. the idea that he should have written about himself, I think, didn't offend him. People think of him as much more self-centered. No, he was self-centered, as much more egocentric. Is there a difference? Yes, I think there is, than he was himself. The question of taste, well, he didn't have all that much good taste in many respects. When he did have good taste, it was, as it were, because it was the way it went in respect of the kind of subject he was tackling. And it didn't offend him because his taste didn't offend him. And therefore, if he wrote Heldenleben and used himself by way of illustration, this was perfectly okay. And if people tackled him on that subject, he would perfectly well say that he found himself as interesting as Alexander the Great. But that doesn't mean he thought he was as great as Alexander the Great, which so many people have said. And therefore Heldenleben is totally misunderstood these days, because they think that he's puffed himself up as a hero. He has used himself purely as illustration, and that first section is not a self-portrait. This is terribly important. It is not. We know exactly the portrait that Strauss had of himself, and it isn't so far off the truth. The beginning of Domestica, which shows that gemütlich, easygoing, perhaps too easygoing fellow. He knew that that was his fault, and that's perhaps why he so loved his wife, who trod on him every day like a doormat. And this, again, in some rather masochistic way, rather tickled him, and it was something that he needed. So that the heroic side wasn't at all the way he saw himself.
Edward Hanslick is another case. Edward Hanslick figured very large in the life of Richard Strauss. Hanslick was a music critic in Vienna. He was also an academic philosopher, and his book, The Beautiful in Music, is by some musical aestheticians thought to be the work of our founding father. Hanslick, as a critic, criticized Richard Strauss' compositions early and late. Strauss was not just caught up in, he was one of the heroes of the controversy over whether music can be programmatic or not, whether music can tell a story and have extra musical reference or not. Hanslick said not, and that's what the whole book, The Beautiful in Music, is about. It is a thesis which argues that music is not for the purpose of exciting emotions, and it is not capable of passing on any kind of narrative or extra musical reference to events or states of mind outside itself. In other words, music for Hanslick is purely formal structure. Here was Strauss, like Liszt, writing orchestral tone poems. Here was Strauss admiring Wagner, conducting his operas, and praising Wagner's music to the sky. And all of that kind of music making, of course, was anathema to Hanslick. So that when any of Strauss's new works were performed in or around Vienna, Hanslick would be there to review these. And review them unfavorably he did, as you might expect. And when quite well on in his career, Strauss accompanied his wife in a Lieder recital, Hanslick had words really only for what he referred to as Strauss's better half, and not for Strauss himself.
Well, Strauss reacted against writing formal works. I mean, having started off by writing string quartets, symphony, violin concerto, all those things in turn, of course, when he jumped onto the Lisztian bandwagon, then he put those things behind him because they didn't attract him anymore. Strauss was surely inspired always by extra musical things. In a way, this is what I found so intriguing in writing about Strauss. If I'd had to write a book on somebody who'd written 83 string quartets, I'd have been in trouble. But because, in fact, the diversity of the subject matter was so interesting, I found him interesting, and I'm quite clear that this is what he found about himself, that he actually enjoyed finding all these different subjects, whether it would be from a Shakespeare play, or it would be from the Don Juan legend, or from Cervantes, or from Greek classical drama. You know, one subject after another. These interested him, the diversity of them, bringing them into a coloristic music pattern. This was what he enjoyed doing, and in the end found that he could do.
And this is a period in which Strauss was in various writings arguing, I think, a very reasonable case that music, of course, must be music first and primarily before it can possibly be anything else. I don't think Strauss ever thought that he was using music just to tell a story. He says he used any story that he happened to pick up as a source of ideas upon which he could elaborate musically. And when he says that, I'm sure he's saying something with which any formalist with his wits about him would have to be in agreement.
And his idea, for instance, to explain in all his works the different human feelings in different tonalities is for me one of the most fantastic experience. For instance, a good example is the E flat, S-dur tonality. You remember in the Heldenleben, the hero's life, the personal engagement on the beginning is S-dur, E flat. And the last resignation, the last, but not resignation in a sense of to finish a life, no, resignation to say, good, I'm satisfied with all what I have done and so on. It is E flat too.
One of the things that had put the more advanced musical community, meaning the theoretic and composition community in America, had put us a little bit off Strauss is that his extra musical conceptions seemed silly to us. You know, the kind of fixation on jokish devils, a rather lumpen-like approach to comedy, words like grotesque, frenzy, seemed not to be part of the spirit of the time. I know that in the correspondence, he would define what he was after in terms of, well, like if he was today and in Broadway, he'd say, let's do a nostalgic piece, or let's do something very, very driving and primitive.
And he's absolutely right. And the E major tonality is one of the most interesting tonalities in his life. E-dur is for him absolutely the tone art of love. Rosenkavalier starts with an E major, and Don Juan starts with an E major. You understand? And if you can remember now the last opera, Capriccio, and the dialogue between the Gräfin, the Countess, and Flamand, the poet, no, Flamand, le musicien, excusez-moi. And you know, the Countess is absolutely not able to decide to whom she can give her love. In the text, in the words, you cannot decide it. But Richard Strauss, by himself, he decided very well. The duet of Countess and the poet is in E flat major. But the duet between Countess and Flamand, the musicien, is E major. A really sincere love between two people on stage by Richard Strauss is always in E-dur, in E major.
be, how he could use materials in an extremely concentrated way, and in 1 to 2 bars present an incredible amount of information, an incredible amount of material. He had a very quick mind, it seems to me. With Strauss, it's often pointed out that he mixes the burlesque with the lyric. This is another way of saying that when you listen to Strauss, you get this expansiveness, this feeling that Goethe called aqueous affirmation. Usually music that seems to be so romantic and so effusive and so ecstatic seems to have a dim-witted center, according to most people. There seems to be something insubstantial at the heart of it, whereas I don't understand how Strauss could do this, how he could combine this kind of neurasthenic, concentrated, contrapuntal manner, and at the same time have everything else that he has. I find that remarkable. I think there are very, very few composers who retain that.
It's why we know of him. There are so many of the sort of post-Bruchian type of composers. So many. Have you ever looked at Braunfels, Symphony No. 6, Opus 96, Symphony No. 8, Opus 104, rows of composers all writing worthy music at that time. Why don't we know of them, There was so much that was, in fact, lacking that particular life, that vigor and that humor and the willingness to shock, the willingness to extend boundaries. I still view Strauss's actual artistic life as a series of curves which overtake each other, and the operatic curve overlaps just, barely just, with the end of the tone poems, with the songs bridging the gap. Later on, he believed that he could only bring himself to life through the medium of the spoken word, so that he found that opera was what he really only thought he could do. This was disproved at the end of his life, but his first adventures into opera, and I'm not counting Guntram, were almost, in effect, tone poems put on the stage. In fact, in my first volume, I called the Salome Electra period the operatic tone poems.
Yes, but my opinion about what you just said is that he was fortuitous in the way he scaled his growth in composition, that he started with sonatas and smaller forms, went on to orchestral writing, and then felt he can attack opera, and I think that had its own rhythm. I think he arrived at opera maybe just from the scale of the compositions always enlarging.
If I had to use a single word for Strauss, it's a rather abstract word, but I call him an intensity composer. I think he saw in a flash, in the relatively early years anyway, just what he was driving towards. I mean, I think he saw, before he even started writing Electra, the structure of the recognition scene, and that in turn was probably prompted by the vision of that extraordinary outburst on the horns which follows the moment when she recognizes Orest. The whole of the opera, both onwards and backwards, can spring from that outburst, if you like. And I think he went all the time for this incredible intensity that you also get in the climaxes of the tone poems, and the rest followed from that. It's also, when I say intensity, indicated by the fact that, you see, when he was bored, it shows. And he admitted it. I mean, look at the music for Johanna and Salome. I mean, it's the only poor music in that otherwise marvelous piece. He wasn't very good at dealing with virtue. Even in the tone poems, Death Transfiguration. Death is fantastic. The Transfiguration is banal. And he said so. There's a marvelous letter to Hofmannsthal about Joseph Lenin, in which he says, really, I find it very boring to deal with anybody who's so virtuous. He wasn't good on the virtue stakes at all.
I don't believe that he was a profound thinker. I do think that he had an instinctive, profound vision into the human heart. And when that came out, he wrote great music. The funny thing about Strauss is the way in which he could sometimes write good music. Of course, like all composers, he could write bad, that isn't the issue. But he could sometimes write good music, but there were periods in his life when he wrote great music. And I think at those times, he was given an insight into what human beings really are and how they felt. And when this came out, he was a great composer. But I do think that he veered between being a really great composer and, in fact, hardly more than a talent.
That's right. But I do think it's a curious sort of trait right the way through his music. He's very good with women. Rarely makes a mistake. Even with minor characters, he's really rather bored with men. I mean, Buchanan is one. I think, personally, that Baron Ochs goes on far too long in Rosenkavalier. But give him the Marshal, give him the end of Act 1, give him the presentation of Silver Rose in Act 2, the trio at the end of Act 3, and oh boy, that's a different story.
And you hit it right on the head when you talked about the female characters in opera, but I would go further. I think that in all of his music, the sense of femaleness is very, very strong. Take the Marschallin. I think no one has ever gotten into a woman's mind and being so beautifully as did Strauss. Not only that, but the whole relationship between her and Octavian, who is also, of course, played by a woman. I don't want to push this too far, what I'm going to say next, but to me, Strauss, of all 20th century composers, is the most aware of the androgynous capability of his characters and also of his own self. I'm sure he was very unrepressed in certain deep, unconscious ways. You look at Intermezzo, which is, of course, about a domestic situation, quite obviously his own. The relationship between male and female principles there, just to take it in a Jungian sense, so to speak, is very profound. I would go further than what you said.
Don't you think this is stereotyping too much, pressing it too much in a certain straitjacket? I was just a spectator, as many were. But, I mean, he was not a friend of great emotional exposure. He liked to live comfortably, not to be very much excited, you know. His sensuality and everything like this came only out in the music. Otherwise, Richard Strauss, in his entire bearing, could have been a successful banker. But the moment the man wrote his music, all this fell away, and he was one of the most dynamic and most sensuous and most emotional composers you can imagine, with the emotions of an iceberg.
He was a cold man, and In his relationships with people, he seems to have been the two extremes. Either he knew them and was warm towards them, in which case he could be genial, jolly even, humorous, unbuttoned, great fun, or he didn't know them, didn't care about them, and he was in fact almost boorish. He was not arrogant, he was just careless. He was cold.
I believe that he was able to separate the personality, his own Richard Strauss, from the personality of composer Richard Strauss. And he was really able to give the stage what the stage needs, because his personal life was so strong, so easy, so simple, that he could really separate all personal things from his manner of writing a score.
Well, in Garmisch, you never noticed any emotional difference. It was always the same thing, very equal, very controlled, and he distanced himself from the material. It all was very, very softened down, you know. He said, if you think about the end of Salome, it's a conversation piece.
And yet, Strauss understood something very deep about that character of Salome, that what he wanted was that unemotional, disengaged quality that some critic once called innocent malice and careless cruelty, that only a voice like Elizabeth Schumann's could have given to that role. Strauss suggested her instead of the usual heroic soprano, and most people thought he must have been kidding or something, because that kind of transparent, girlish clarity of tone that Elizabeth Schumann had seemed to be so unfitting. And I find that an extremely interesting perception about not only that role, but about the whole romantic nature of the female.
There's a story that he's supposed to have had an affair with Elizabeth Schumann, but I don't believe a word of it, and I don't believe that he had an affair with anybody. He's supposed to have been actually sexually cold. Certainly he enjoyed being trodden on by his wife, and this is part of the masochistic relationship he had with this very domineering woman.
Well, I tell you something, excuse me if I interrupt. Mrs. Pauline was at least as great a housewife as he was a composer. I mean, Richard Strauss had very little to do with the household. I just remember one instance. I ate there almost every evening, and she liked goulash, you know. And he complained, and he said, well, Paulson, again this goulash. I said, really, who do you think you are? Do you eat what I put in front of you? This was about the tone. I tell you quite frankly, I have a feeling that if she hadn't been as she was, Strauss would not have been alert as he was.
It's really strange you mentioned this, because I was going to bring this up. It's eerie that you mentioned this. I'll tell you why. I was thinking of the following. In Edward Gibbon's famous work on the Roman Empire, when he's writing about Theodora in Byzantium, I mean, she was a prostitute and a vicious leader involved with color wars and all sorts of things. He was totally haunted by this woman, obviously, because when you read the footnotes, all in Latin, he has these very disturbing and disturbed comments about her. And it's obvious that he was a man obsessed with Theodora, to such an extent that even though he assassinated her character, he was totally fascinated by her beauty and her aura. Gibbon was so unable to deal with that side of himself. But Strauss is so in touch with those two elements, the male and the female, in himself and in terms of identifying with characters, that he has no problem, it seems to me. Not only does he not have a problem, but he seems to be purveying what I would call a deeply androgynous vision in his music. And I know maybe that sounds bizarre, but I'm very struck by that.
I think in the case of Strauss, it is true, he had this duality of life, where all that perhaps people would have liked to have seen in his behavior went into his art. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't also a very voluptuous thinker inside himself, even though perhaps while he conducted Salome, he would have despised somebody who threw himself about and expressed the emotionalism of it. No doubt when he was writing it, he must have felt all those things. And when he actually sat down to put it on paper, I don't believe that he looked like that picture that you will see. Krause's book on Strauss, whoever it was, actually drew onto a photograph sort of idea of the highly sexual, highly charged, emotional Strauss. I think it's all nonsense. I don't think he looked like that at all. But there's no doubt that something went on inside him, because the music does come out like that.
I think it was around 1909, the harpsichordist Wanda Landowska published a book in French, Musique Ancienne, Ancient Music. And she prefaced this by saying that Richard Strauss, in an essay titled, Is There an Avant-Garde?, claimed that there was an inevitable law of progression, a law relating to increased complexity, and that this would manifest itself by increasing chromaticism, by increasing complexity along every line, but certainly along such syntactical ones as chromaticism would imply. I have carefully looked at this essay, Is There an Avant-Garde?, and I can find nothing in which Strauss claims that he is at a higher point in a continuum to which Beethoven belongs. And Landowska claimed that he said exactly that. And I don't think she would have said that unless it was in the air that Strauss was some kind of a horror, some kind of a vandal, a barbarian, bursting into our culture with all this kind of thing and stretching it and straining it irresponsibly and chaotically.
Oh, yes. But there was a weakness, a vein of weakness. And it's a funny thing, one draws analogies between a man's character and his appearance. And it is possible that there is a connection. Wasn't it Fritz Busch who referred to his watery blue eyes, expressionless, which gives a strange picture of this man with this great big forehead and tall gait, who cared nothing for anybody. The broad forehead tapering away to the rather weak chin. You know, there is something there. It's not all strength. There is immense strength and immense culture and immense humanity. But there was weakness too. And I think that this weakness in the end was his undoing in the periods when, in fact, the world did him badly. And the world did do him badly.
That was Act One of The Bourgeois Hero, a conversation piece about the life and work of Richard Strauss.